Welcome back to my channel. So I recently purchased the Samsung S22 Ultra. This is a great smartphone. It has great cameras. In fact, I think this phone is quite famous for its cameras. And I wanted to compare the camera on this phone to my Canon R5. And I searched online, and I really couldn't find a detailed comparison of how the camera performs on the S22 Ultra versus a professional camera like the Canon R5. And for me, I really wanted to test out a few things. Number one, was the camera as good as my Canon R5? Because the Canon R5 is an amazing camera. Number two, are there certain scenarios where the phone is just as good or maybe even better than my Canon R5 that I can leave the camera behind and just rely on my phone? I'm a very enthusiastic amateur photographer. I love shooting birds in flight, animals. I love taking portraits of family and friends. So I thought I would test this camera and compare it to the Canon R5 in certain specific scenarios. So I thought I would test portraits, birds in flight, and seated birds, and night photography, landscapes, and maybe a shot of the moon, because I've seen some very impressive moon shots with the S22 Ultra.
Let me go through the cameras on the S22 Ultra. So there are four cameras in the back. There's a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera with an aperture of f2.2. There's a main camera which is 108 megapixels, but it actually pixel bins it down to 12 megapixel. There's a 10 megapixel telephoto camera which can go up to 10x optical zoom. The aperture is f4.9. And then there's another 10 megapixel telephoto camera which can go to 3x optical zoom with an aperture of 2.4. So I was trying to find a comparison of the actual physical sensor size of the S22 Ultra and the Canon R5. I couldn't find one, so I drew one based on the dimensions they gave. So the sensor size of the S22 Ultra is 1 by 1/3 of an inch, which is about this big. And the Canon is 2.6 by 2.4 centimeters, which is that big. So there's a significant difference in size of the two sensors. The individual pixel size is 0.9 microns on the S22 and 4.3 microns on the R5. So that's a much bigger pixel, so it gathers more light. There's more detail. The S22 actually has 108 megapixels, so that's a huge megapixel number. But then it pixel bins it down to 12 megapixels, whereas the Canon R5 is 45 megapixels. So when you hear 108 megapixels, you think there's lots of details, big sensor, but that may not always be true. So here is a test of the portrait mode. This is outside in pretty good lighting conditions. Canon R5 on the left and Samsung S22 Ultra on the right. So here the Samsung is using the 10 megapixel 3x zoom with an aperture f2.4, ISO is 40 with a fairly high shutter speed. The Canon R5 also has a fairly high shutter speed, f2.8 with an ISO of 100, so somewhat comparable. So remember, the Canon is a high megapixel camera. There's 44 megapixels, whereas the Samsung is 12 megapixels. So when you look at this image on the Samsung screen, it looks like a great image. The colors are vivid. The background blurring looks pretty good. Now, when you zoom in, several differences start to emerge. So when you zoom in on the out of focus areas, you can see that the Samsung has kind of drawn through what it thinks is the edge. So that's the AI edge detection working. And this looks quite unnatural. See, some of the hair is cut off. And then if you look down here, the background, which is inside the hair, looks in focus, and the background out here looks sharply out of focus. So the edge detection here, while good, looks pretty artificial. You probably wouldn't notice it when you're zoomed out, but when you zoom in, and once you see this, you can't unsee it. Whereas, this on the Canon, it looks very natural, like it would on an optical zoom lens. And then when you zoom in on the face, you can see that the Canon image is much smoother. The resolution obviously is much better here, and you see a lot of noise on the S22 Ultra, mainly because of the small size of the sensor, despite it having a lower ISO. But if you go in here and do a little bit of noise reduction on Lightroom, you can make it look pretty good. But there's just still a lot more detail, on the Canon images. If you look at the eyebrows, look at the strands of hair. The Canon is a much better picture, but this is quite close. And on a smartphone screen, this is probably pretty good. So here I have moved closer to the subject. This is the S22 using the same 3x optical zoom camera and the Canon on the left. So when you move closer, you can see that the Samsung's edge detection works much better, right? So here it looks like a more natural background blur. You can see some of the hair it thinks some of the hair is a background, so the edge detection is having a hard time when there's so much extra hair. But overall, it looks much more natural than the one taken at a slightly farther distance. You can see some of the drawing here where it tries to decide what's hair and what's background, but it's done much more efficiently than when you're farther out. As far as the background blurring goes, you can see that on the Canon, the out of focus area is much more pleasing. And it is less so on the S22 Ultra. That being said, you can adjust the strength of the background blurring and the patterns, but then it might look a little more unnatural, and you might be able to see the edges here, a little more. Okay, now what about when conditions are a little more challenging? So this is a backlit portrait. There's a window behind, so the subject is backlit. This is straight out of the camera, both JPEGs, Canon on the right and S22 Ultra on the left. Now in this image, when you look from this far, the S22 image looks much more pleasing. The phone has already applied some HDR. It has done some of the heavy lifting for you. It has adjusted the highlights. It's added more saturation. And when you zoom in, you can kind of see more, processing going on. Obviously, the Canon image is much more sharper. There's more detail on the Canon image. But when you view it on social media, for a quick picture, this is actually very good. Now, can you get a similar look on the Canon? Obviously you can. So here I increased the shutter speed, and what I did was I exposed for the highlights and then brought the shadows up. So here this image in Canon looks somewhat similar to the S22, but then on the Canon, I have to think about doing it. I have to expose for the highlights, and then bring it into Lightroom and raise the shadows, whereas the phone, it does everything for you. So if you wanted to take a quick shot like this, I think the Samsung S22 does a better job. Whereas in the Canon, obviously there's infinite flexibility. Ultimately, you will get a better shot if you know what you're doing. But if you want to do something quickly, I think the Samsung S22 does a very good job. So, anytime you take an image like this, oftentimes you find in the image files a much lower resolution 0.2 megapixel file on the Samsung. I think it's taking two pictures and superimposing these, to give you the final result. So obviously if there's motion, that could affect how the results turn out, but it's still quite impressive what a little smartphone can do. What about in low light? So this on the left is the Canon at a shutter speed of 1/30. The new mirrorless cameras are very good at hand holding at slow shutter speeds, but look at the ISO, it's 12,800. And the Samsung is on the right, and the Samsung's image stabilization is very impressive. You can hand hold down into the single digits. This is 1/10 of a second, f2.4, and ISO is only 1,250. But if you zoom in, you can see there's a lot of image noise on the Canon. And there's a lot of image noise on the Samsung as well. The Samsung image is rendered brighter, but there's much less detail on the Samsung, despite it having a smaller ISO, and that is down to the small sensor size and also this lower megapixel sensor. So here I have edited both images to a similar extent, and again on a small screen, the Samsung image looks very impressive. But when you zoom in a little bit, I think the Canon image is definitely cleaner. But again, this is very impressive for what a smartphone can do. And as you come in close, you'll see there's really no detail in the hair, but that's to be expected. And there's definitely more detail on the Canon images. So what about birds in flight? Can the 100x zoom on the Samsung capture birds in flight? Now this is a challenging condition where the bird is actually backlit. Keeping the bird in the frame on the Samsung S22 at 100x zoom is exceedingly difficult. So this is a shot I was able to capture. Settings are 1/1400. This is what the camera chose. f4.9, ISO 40. Image on the left is a Canon 1/1000th of a second, f7.1, 44 megapixel image. So the image on the right is really unusable. There's no detail on the bird, and I played around with the sliders on Lightroom, and I couldn't bring any detail out. Anything I do really makes a picture worse. I can't bring out any shadows, so it completely destroys the image. Now the image on the left is the Canon. It doesn't look too different from this one from here, but as soon as you expose the image properly, and again this is also a challenging image, but you can see there's so much more detail on the Canon image. So there's no contest between these two. Yes, this bird was very far. Both of them were far. Both of them were challenging. But you can just see that on the Canon, the resolving power of the sensor is much greater than on the Samsung. So obviously for a bird in flight, I would not use the Samsung unless the bird was big and flying very close to me. What about for perched birds? So here on the right, I'm using the Samsung S22 Ultra, using the 100x zoom. So once again, it's very hard to keep the bird in focus unless you're using a tripod or unless you have very steady hands. So I took many shots, and all of them pretty much look like this. So the image is totally unusable. There's no detail at all on the bird. And this is the Canon on the left. This is at 500mm zoom, so it's a smaller image, but if you bring it in closer and digitally zoom in, this image is so much sharper than this one. And remember, this is a JPEG straight out of camera without any adjustments, and if you adjust the JPEG, or even better, if you adjust a raw image, the image will turn out to be really good. Now you can shoot in the Pro mode and adjust settings by yourself. And you can use the 3x optical zoom, which is a maximum zoom it'll let you do. But even with the optical zoom, photographing birds is very tough, especially when there are branches in front, and critical focus is very difficult to achieve. So what about stationary objects? So here's a Samsung on the right with the 100x zoom on my grill cover. The good news is you can read the lettering, but the bad news is there's no detail at all. So Samsung uses a lot of software manipulation and AI to create this image. So if you just want to read it, it would probably be okay. But look at the Canon image. Even when you zoom in digitally, there's so much detail. You can actually see the actual individual threads in the stitch. One area that Samsung really impressed me was in night photography. So if you have stationary subjects, the Samsung, you can handle it at very low shutter speeds, and I think it uses, it probably takes one or two images and fuses them together to get a more detailed image. and this image looks really good. And this is the image on the Canon. It's at 1 by 1/10 of a second handheld, but several images were shaky, so you had to take a few images to get one that was sharp. And this one looks somewhat similar to this, but I still think there's a little more detail in the Samsung images. If you look at the ground here and the driveway, I think there's more detail on the Samsung images. Now obviously you can get really good images on the Canon if you had it on a tripod, but then I wanted to test these both out just handheld, like you would if you're walking at night and you want to take a quick picture. I think the Samsung would probably do a better job. Now it's a 12 megapixel image, so it's a smaller image, so as you zoom in you definitely lose some detail at greater zoom lengths, and you have more detail on the Canon just because of the bigger sensor size. So good job Samsung on this one. I tested out the 100x zoom in shooting the moon, and there's several videos on YouTube where you can get pretty decent images. But handheld, this is a very difficult task. It's very hard to keep the moon info in the frame and also try to focus on it. So a lot of the images would look like this. Most of the images would be really bad, and once in a while you would get a pretty decent image that looked like this, which is very impressive for a phone. But you lose a lot of details, especially if it's handheld. I suppose if you put it on a tripod and take the pains to go through it, you might get a better quality image. By comparison, this is a shot of the moon I took on another date with my Canon 100 to 500 millimeter lens. So with the Canon, you can pretty much point the moon is a pretty big object in the sky. So with the Canon, you can pretty much look at it, handhold it, and take an image, and pretty much every time it'll end up exactly like this. So it's much easier to get good moonshots with the Canon handheld than it is with the Samsung, and you get much more detailed images of each and every crater and so forth. This is on the Canon on the left and on the Samsung on the right, and right away the Samsung images pop much more than the Canon on the left. So again, Samsung is using a lot of HDR goodness to bring out the details in the sky, the landscape. There's more saturation. The Canon images, if you zoom in, are a little more detailed, but the Samsung is doing a great job with rendering this landscape. So I think the Samsung is better here. Now I have processed the Canon image on the left to bring out some detail in the sky by decreasing the highlights and increasing the saturation a little bit. And now the Canon image looks just as good as the Samsung, but I had to work a little harder to get the same result. So if you have your phone in your pocket, you're walking around, then I think for landscapes the Samsung is probably a better bet. And there's when there's trees around, it really doesn't matter if you lose a little bit of detail, right? It's the grand scene that impresses. If you guys have reached this far, I would really appreciate you subscribing to the channel and also clicking the like button. I do this out of pure fun and enjoyment, so it'll encourage me to keep doing more videos like this. So what are my thoughts after having used the phone and the camera for a while now? So I do think the S22 Ultra is similar or maybe even slightly better than the Canon R5 when you're shooting handheld night landscapes, because it gets you more detail with less work without having to use a tripod. Also, when you're shooting backlit subjects, the phone does a much better job of rendering instant HDR, whereas with the camera you have to adjust your shooting style to get similar pictures. I think you can also use the S22 Ultra in good light for portraits, especially when you move really close to the subject and use the 10x or 3x optical zoom, provided there's not too much stray hair. Now the S22 Ultra is certainly not good for birds in flight or small perch birds. And it's not very good at shooting the moon, although I have seen really good moon shots on the internet. So will I ditch my Canon R5 Obviously not. It's a great camera. What I might do is complement the Canon R5 with the S22 in some of the scenarios that I mentioned previously. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. It was certainly fun making it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.